Hi, today I'm going to share with you how we have helped providers use their data to help solve the employee turnover challenge. Throughout today's discussion, I'll talk about how data science can help reduce turnover. We'll also look at how we've done this type of work in the past and how other agencies could go on and do it themselves. We'll share findings and recommendations and how those are developed, and also highlight ways to help stay on track. First of all, what is data? So, data is really any information that you can gather. Now, in terms of these projects, our focus is really around the quantitative and qualitative data, and I'll explain in more detail what that is further in the presentation. But for now, I would like to go through a brief illustration. When we think of data, we might picture a typical spreadsheet, rows and columns, a bunch of information on there. When you look at that just as it is, it's not very meaningful. But what we can do with that information or data is we can start to identify different characteristics or attributes that are either unique or similar to others within the data set. So once we're able to identify these, from there, we can really start to group and cluster and identify maybe similarities between or within the different groups. What we're able to do from there is really start to build connections. So what these connections do is they actually help offer meaning and insight. So when we talk about completing a data evaluation in order to help reduce turnover, we really recommend going about it in a pretty specific way. First of all, what's going to be key is to make sure that staff are aware of what's going on. We've really, in the past, we held a project kickoff, and we find that that is very helpful in order to help get your staff engaged and also to prepare them for what's coming. From there, you would gather the quantitative data from an employee management or HR system. So this is where it's going to be really key to make sure that you have complete and clean information. In order to develop a good analysis, you really do need to be able to have information in a consistent manner on all of your employees. We'll talk again more specifically on what that would look like later on. From there, you can actually perform the quantitative data analysis. And as I mentioned before, these analysis, it's really important to focus not only on the quantitative piece, so that raw data coming from the employee management or HR system, but also the qualitative end. And so for the qualitative piece, it's going to be about sending out staff surveys and performing interviews for this qualitative analysis. From there, you'll evaluate the results of the quantitative and qualitative analysis, and then use that information to identify key findings. From there, recommendations can be developed, and then it's going to be important to track progress and also reanalyze the quantitative data to really understand the impact of what recommendations have been implemented and which ones are really triggering change at your organization. So, the quantitative analysis. So, this is again, as I mentioned, important to have very clean information. From there, you can evaluate multiple data points for every employee. And historically, we've looked at 5 to 7 years of history, and we find that that's really important in order to really understand the true state of the organization prior to implementing any kind of changes. And then from there, we actually were able to create something called a tenure curve. Now, a tenure curve I'll review in the next slide. But what the tenure curve is going to do is it's going to study the change of employment during that first year. Now, this is for our cases, we've looked at 1 year of employment, but it could potentially be longer than that if you would like. So what this tenure curve is actually doing is identifying the percentage of your employees that are employed at each given day for that first year. So here you can see that at 30 days, about 10% of the workforce has left, but by the time you reach 1 year, only 67% is still employed. So this is really going to tell us agency-wide where the organization is standing. What this allows us to do is not only understand where they're at, but it also establishes a baseline when we look at other characteristics in comparison, which I'll have an example of that in just a short bit. So when we evaluate the tenure curves by segments, what we do is we break it up based on those different attributes that your employees may have, whether it be age at hire, which department, work status, whatever those different attributes, again, that you're tracking consistently in your HR system. And the purpose of this is to really understand what is unique about the different segments within your employee groups. From there, you can also evaluate which segments are falling below the agency-wide tenure curve. So what this helps us understand better is which groups are driving the tenure curve down versus up. Now, that being said, we don't want to say that these are the only people you should hire if they're above the tenure curve. That's not at all what we're getting at here. The goal and the action behind this is to really understand from a data-driven perspective what's going on with those folks that are below the curve and what changes can be made to help improve their tenure. So the quantitative analysis, what that helps us to do is identify the what is happening. So where are we at? And the qualitative really helps us identify why. So what is going on within these numbers that is triggering them to have a below average tenure? And what we find is that recommendations, when they're implemented in order to help those falling below the curve, they actually end up helping the whole organization. So each group ends up improving their tenure over time. And so here's an example where we took the age at hire into consideration when evaluating it against the agency-wide tenure curve. So here, the agency-wide tenure curve is this kind of gray one, kind of hidden here in the mix. But what we were able to do is identify which groups are falling below this curve. And as you can see, it's typically the folks that are under 30. So that led us to ask the question, what's going on here with these groups? And we were able to then use the qualitative information to better understand why this was happening. And so again, you're not limited to age at hire or any of the different segments that we mentioned in the previous slide. But what is important is to understand which information you have is consistent across the board, because that way you get really good analysis out of it. And you can really identify your different groupings better in terms of how they're doing against the organization as a whole. And the quantitative analysis, so we don't only use that information to create a tenure curve, you also have the opportunity to identify other things such as trends over time, analysis by regions, items of importance to your organization. It's really just a matter of what information you are capturing within your HR system. And so you can see here that we looked at voluntary terminations by department over time just to kind of see which departments were really having the highest turnover. You can also look at things like average tenure by zip code. So this is an example where they looked at their different locations to better understand, where is it that people are staying longer versus not? And there's also other information. So a lot of times what we recommend folks do is also include termination reasons within that data pull from the HR system. And you can see here, this group wanted to also identify, okay, what months are triggering the most misconduct or no-shows or attendance issues. And this just helped them identify when they need to make sure that they're doing better training throughout the year. Again, this is just information that is at your fingertips as long as you're housing it in a nice system that you can easily pull the data out of. Now, from there, this is obviously the quantitative analysis that there is, but there's also this qualitative piece. So the qualitative piece is also very important. As I mentioned before, it really adds context and explains the why behind what is going on when it comes to the quantitative information. So when we think about this, there are really two main ways we go about this: your surveys and interviews. So surveys are important because you need to make sure that every person within your organization has that opportunity to provide their own insight and feedback. And then from there, the interviews are a subset of that population. So in terms of interviews, what we recommend and what we've done in our projects is we take a proportional approach in terms of the population to make sure we're getting good representation from different individuals. From there, it's also important that employees' names and identifying information be held confidentially. So in order to get good feedback, employees need to understand and feel comfortable sharing without there being repercussions. In addition to that, from both the interviews and the surveys, really we're able to help determine the level of engagement by role. You're able to identify staff pain points, peer differences, and really help see what's really important to staff. Sometimes folks in leadership don't always know what's the most important thing for staff, but the staff, if it's information that is being shared consistently, it's definitely worth looking into. And here's some examples of feedback that we've seen in projects we've done from different provider employees. So some things are very positive. Most people like their jobs and they believe that they have a positive impact on the people they're serving. There oftentimes are less favorable responses as well. Staff want more feedback, they're feeling overwhelmed, stressed, not getting enough training or development. And then you have those significant irritations or frustrations, such as last minute scheduling changes, old technology tools that are unreliable or unfortunately often down. And the most important thing from this information that you're gathering and this opportunity that you're giving your employees to share is that caregivers and direct support providers get an opportunity to really share their thoughts. So again, this is just so important because from here, what we're able to do and what you'll be able to do is take a look at that quantitative and qualitative information, evaluate the results, and then from there, develop those findings. So when we talk about findings, what are we talking about exactly? Findings need to be more than one person reporting them, right? So these are issues that have come up time and time again through the interviews, through the surveys, and then on top of that, that quantitative information kind of feeds into it and helps really confirm what's being said. So findings we typically see are things like people don't feel like they're compensated fairly. And our recommendation to that would be to educate employees on the compensation system, but then also to utilize a system that's based on merit, knowledge, and experience. A lot of times organizations do across the board increases, which can be very helpful in some ways, but those folks that might have a longer time with the organization or come in with more experience, they may feel like they're not being compensated fairly. In addition to that, typically supervisors are at times uncommunicative or even unprofessional. And so from there, we develop recommendations such as developing a supervisor training curriculum to include topics like HR law, emotional intelligence, purpose-driven leadership, and also communication. Another finding is around scheduling. Oftentimes that comes up a fair amount. People feel like there's last minute changes, they're working unwanted overtime. So a recommendation from there would be to implement a scheduling system, which would help quickly communicate the schedule, also identifying locations that need folks and bring an awareness to supervisors and managers about the potential overtime that's out there. In addition to that, we found that employees feel that orientation and their early training did not prepare them for their role. So recommendations around this issue was really to improve the specificity and onboarding at hire and provide a detailed plan to employees to clearly state all the steps an employee needs to be successful. Some folks that we talked to in the past felt like they were set up to fail, and that's never a good place to start a new job. So it's really important to make sure that when a new employee comes on board at your organization, that they're given the tools to be successful. In addition to these, another finding we found is around career paths. So some employees feel like they're not sure how to move up with their organization. Many of them want to. So recommendations around this that we've shared in the past were about posting jobs internally with detailed descriptions of the requirements and develop a career pathing program to help clarify the steps employees can take in order to move to that next level role. So these are consistent and repeat findings that we've actually found across multiple providers, and they might be worth taking a look at, even before doing a project like this, if this is an issue that might be going on at your company. So when we talk about, the findings and the recommendations, it's not enough just to say, okay, this is what we think we need to do. It's obviously important to execute that plan. So in addition to developing those findings, recommendations, the next step would be really to understand how to achieve those different tasks. But then from there, it's important to really get an understanding of where things are at. So here we have an example where I took the quantitative and the qualitative information, as you can see in the initial period, which has been completed. And then from there, each quarter, tracking progress that the organization is making toward the different goals. So I mentioned compensation system. You can see here that it's in the planning mode. Supervisor training is active, growth opportunities complete, scheduling complete, and then improved specificity and onboarding not yet started. So it's really important to track your progress. That way you can really understand what's moving the dial and you can make sure that you're sticking with the plan, right? Again, we don't want to just identify issues and develop findings. We want to make sure that we're following through on those. And then when tracking progress, really it's important to go back and say, okay, how are we doing? And from there, you can actually reanalyze that 10-year curve. So here's an example of an organization where after their first reporting period, which was the initial one for the project, their tenure at 365 days on average was around 52.77%. After implementing just a couple of things, actually they didn't implement any of them fully, they actually saw an improvement in their tenure curve for that first year up to 55.19%. So this may not seem like a lot of change and a lot of movement, but again, this was without really fully implementing any of the recommendations. And in addition to that, this is a short period of time and it's with a very big group. So when you think about that, a 3% change when you have hundreds of employees, it's pretty big at the end of the day. And so again, as I mentioned, it's important that you're tracking that progress and then reevaluating, reanalyzing that quantitative data to identify how you're doing. And it's also important to monitor other results. So here you can see some trending over time. This is actually with that same group as in the previous slide. And so you can see here that starting in October 20, which was right around the time that the project kicked off, actually, you saw this improvement over time in terms of the number of terminations. And actually, when the surveys and interviews happened, that was in December and January. And you can see from there on out, it's really improved. And that speaks volumes to, the confidence that the employees at this organization had that their managers were going to take their word and, really understand what they could do better in order to help improve their employees' tenure. And so in conclusion, the whole goal of doing so is obviously to improve employee tenure, right? And so what you're able to do is take your data, evaluate it, identify the results and actions, and then monitor progress along the way. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, it's important to reanalyze those results. And what we find is improved employee tenure at providers. It helps improve employee satisfaction. It reduces rehiring costs, and it promotes a more consistency in a client's caregiving team. And if you need more information on the provider employee turnover challenge, please check out our ebook at sandata.com. From there, you're going to be able to dive in a little bit deeper and take a closer look at the different issues impacting our industry. Thank you.